Max Verstappen called it a disaster. Red Bull team principal Laurent Mekies was apologetic. Chinese Grand Prix sprint qualifying couldn't have gone much worse for Red Bull. Verstappen down in 8th, mixing it with the midfield. So what went wrong?
It's been a surprise. After coming out of Australia, we expected Red Bull to potentially be up there. Max Verstappen started at the back, came through. If it started near the front, people expected him to be in that battle for a podium. It didn't happen, but here is a surprise. And basically, the story is a lack of grip. This is a very different track to Australia. It's not so reliant on power deployment. It's not so reliant on harvesting as much as you can. Much more onus is on car performance. And the story of Max Verstappen and Isaac Hadjar's qualifying is not enough grip. Bit of understeer, car not handling so well. You're then affecting the tyres. You're then impacting your deployment. This kind of circle that goes around basically pushes you back into the midfield.
I had a slightly different perspective of it in terms of the fact I was down at turn 1, 2, 3 in sprint quali. You can see that corner, I think, behind us. And some of the reasons why they were struggling, that lack of grip, particularly the sort of slightly weak front end, I could really see that, particularly at that long turn 3. Max Verstappen, when he's got that understeer, he looks like a driver subdued. Isaac Hadjar, he was looking a little bit more disconnected with it, but you could see those traits, and then I discovered it was repeated around the lap, given that huge performance deficit. And it just shows that the move to this track has just shown low speed performance seems a bit of a weakness. There's still a deployment disadvantage, but chassis weakness, or at least setup weakness.
Yeah, I think this is a weekend where we're seeing a different performance profile across teams. There's an element of the power units are behaving slightly differently team to team, but also teams are making a lot of progress in their understanding. We're seeing a bit more fluctuations, and I think we're seeing patterns now of which teams are nailing these regulations and which are still struggling.
Now, McLaren were best of the rest. Lando Norris put in a good lap. Do we think that's indicative that McLaren is making progress, slashing that deployment gap, if you want to call it that, to Mercedes that we saw in Australia?
I think progress is the right word. A lot of the work has gone on in Woking the last week, a lot of work with Mercedes HPP, just to understand that deployment. I think they were caught by surprise in Australia about the level of knowledge that Mercedes had, how kind of sophisticated their energy management was. They've tried to understand it. They're making progress. They're chipping away. They're not there yet. There is a little gap that still exists, but they're pushing on, and that gap that perhaps explains half of their deficit in Melbourne has now come down a little bit. But also the chassis isn't there. That, I think even McLaren would admit themselves, that chassis is not on a par with where Mercedes is. Andrea Stellis openly talked about this car has kind of carried through from testing with only very minor upgrades. There's some major stuff coming. So I think it's going to be a case for McLaren of chipping away, getting that deployment improved, bringing improvements to the chassis, and hopefully that can lift them closer to that fight to Mercedes.
And they were very much in a fight with Ferrari. The Ferrari chassis is clearly good, some pretty good corner speeds in places, so you can make a case the Ferrari might be, if you eliminate the power units, the best car aerodynamically and mechanically. But we saw they took off their, whatever you want to call it, the flip-top rear wing, the Macarena wing. There's all sorts of names for it. Choose whichever one's your favourite. But that ran in FP1, and it wasn't on for sprint qualifying. Lewis Hamilton had a spin approaching turn 4 just after shutting it. Was that something to do with it, or was there some other reason for it being taken off?
No, the team suspect that spin this morning was more down to deployment. It's something we've seen other drivers have. Franco Colapinto had a spin this morning, similar-ish circumstances. Obviously, Max Verstappen qualifying in Melbourne had a spin when the rear's locked up. So I think it's more about how you're harvesting and the way this power unit's working. The wing does bring a benefit, but from what I understand of Ferrari's kind of analysis is that the gap to Mercedes is so big right now that the potential downsides of running a wing that you've not done lots of race distances on, could be reliability troubles, you don't know the true impact over race distance. Actually, it's better to go into the race with something you know, something you understand, until you get to a position where you are close to Mercedes. And I think Ferrari will readily admit at the moment that the gap to Mercedes is just too big, even for a upside down wing to help them close down.
But we do expect them to go forward in the sprint race, not just because they're very, very fast off the line, but also because the Ferrari race pace relative to McLaren does look good, and the car looks very nimble on track, particularly down at turn 2, 3. You could see it, and Hamilton in particular seemed very, very in tune with it, I have to say, compared to Leclerc, so positive for him. But of course, it was Mercedes to the fore. George Russell on pole once again, Kimi Antonelli in behind him. And one thing that was very noticeable from trackside is just how at one Russell is with the car, very, very smooth. Antonelli a bit more attacking. He worked at it as qualifying progressed, but it seems that not only is Mercedes really on top of the power unit, but George Russell in particular is really in tune with the way you drive it to get the most pace out of it.
Yeah, he's been impeccable again. Apart from that, FP1 in Australia, where I think Mercedes itself was a bit lost in terms of where it was at with the regulations, how best to deploy it. Since then, they've switched it on brilliantly. George has been on top of that car just at the moment, and this probably comes from experience, just a step ahead of Kimi. Obviously, he's got many more years' experience. Kimi's getting there, chipping away, putting him under pressure. Isn't out of this championship fight, isn't out of the fight for regular wins. But at the moment, George just seems very comfortable with where the car is, very comfortable with this new style of being quick, which can often be about how slow you go into corners, how you treat the corner entry more to get a benefit on the corner exit. So very on top of the regulations, with a car that is very on top of the regulations, and a power unit that has mastered these regulations. It's all pointing towards a lot more success for Mercedes.
And one thing I did like about Antonelli is you could see just from trackside down at turn 2, 3, even between his 2 laps in SQ3, you could see him evolving, taking a step, moving closer to what Russell was doing. So he is learning fast, and that experience gap will close, but it's still going to take a long time. Also in the world of Mercedes, customer team Alpine. Now, we expected them pre-season to be vying for the lead of the midfield. Pierre Gasly put it 7th today. So what's the real picture? Here in Bahrain pre-season testing, or what we saw in Australia where they struggled, particularly in qualifying?
Yeah, I think Australia was much slower and a poorer weekend than they anticipated. There is this high-speed instability problem they've got, manifests itself in understeer, which points to a front wing weakness. They've got an upgrade coming, which can help them on that front, but this hurt them a lot in Australia, and a weekend where a lot of teams were struggling with deployment, so it just didn't click at all. I mean, at one point it looked like Alpine had made barely any progress from 12 months ago, which was different to Bahrain testing, and I think we're now back into a scenario where it is much better. The front wing weakness isn't as exposed here. There's not as many critical high-speed corners. And Pierre Gasly's just been at one with the car from the very first lap in FP1. Very few setup differences, steady progress in deployment, absolutely nailed qualifying, and put himself in a fight for potentially a lot of points. A much stronger weekend. They're not pretending that they've suddenly broken through and are ready to challenge the top 4 teams week in, week out. But it shows there is potential in the Alpine package, and the reason why they went for a Mercedes customer deal.
Absolutely, and that put him just ahead of Max Verstappen. The Hasseloli Behrman is right there, and he's at Hadjar, so that'll be an interesting battle to watch tomorrow. And looking at the bigger picture, we had the extremes, the energy-poor Australian Grand Prix, and we've got a very different track right at the other end of the spectrum, harvest-rich, as some teams refer to it. This has really put the best foot forward of these new cars, hasn't it?
Yeah, we went to Australia and we knew it wasn't going to be the best stomping ground for these regulations. One of the worst energy-starved tracks of the season, in the bottom 4. And I think it was, the fans didn't like it, watching those cars between turn 6 and turn 9. We didn't like watching it. The drivers didn't like driving them in that section, and it exposed the problems when these cars don't have any battery. But here there's only one section of the track where they especially run a lot out of battery, which is the run down the back straight. So a lot of the circuit, they're pushing on, they're getting sideways, the drivers are being challenged. The last corner here is always being spectacular for Formula 1 cars throughout the years, and even with this generation of cars, we see drivers on the edge, we see drivers getting it wrong, we see drivers running across that gravel trap. So I think we've got we've seen a lot more potential from these regulations, a lot of more promise from these regulations, but we still need to see what they're like in a race, because there's still a theory that because Australia was so energy starved with the cars, it made qualifying not so great, but made the racing better. Are we going to see the flip side here? And we've had a great qualifying session and the racing not so good.
Yeah, one thing I did notice when watching trackside in sprint quali is while the cars they're a tiny bit disappointing in turn 1, they still look quite good when you're on the inside there carrying the speed in, but it gets bled off quite quickly with some super clipping. And then actually turn 2, 3, which is slow, they look really good, they're sharp, they're agile, they look better than last year. And then when they put that power down, when they get full deployment at the exit of the corner, it takes off like a rocket. You can see it, and that's marked in difference to last year. So that's very, very encouraging. And I think we are seeing Formula 1 2026 style at its best, but the race tomorrow is going to tell us a lot more about whether we'll see the yo-yo racing, how much overtaking there will be, so we'll learn a lot more tomorrow. But right now, Mercedes very much on top.